Well, listen, it is 7 o'clock, so
Okay.
let's get rolling out of respect for you and your time and everybody else that's joining us. Okay, well, I'd like to thank everyone for being with us this evening. My name is Ellen Stevie. I'm the co-founder of NuBowWow, the Puppy Starter Kit. If you're getting a puppy or know someone who is, the Puppy Starter Kit makes a great gift. Please take a moment to check out our site at the conclusion of the presentation. We are very excited to have with us tonight Lew Olson, author of Raw and Natural Nutrition for Dogs. Lew has been showing dogs since 1974. She's an American kennel judge, has a master's degree in social work, and a PhD in natural nutrition. Before I turn it over to Lew, I would just like everybody to know, please, we'd love to entertain your questions. Feel free to email us at ellen@nubowwow.com, and that would be ELLEN@NuBowWow.com. Lew, welcome. We appreciate your time this evening, and you're on.
Thanks, Ellen. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Our first subject I'm going to talk about tonight is the untold history of dog food. And when I first started dabbling in feeding my dogs, I started with home cooked. It was in 1985, and after that I moved to raw. Part of that was due to my grandmother. And both of my grandparents fed a raw diet with some cooked, because they also fed table scraps in those days, because you have to remember dog food is a fairly new invention in the big picture. Dog food was developed, the original was Spratt's biscuits in the 1800s, but it was used for high tea for rich people's dogs. And as a total food, it didn't really break out until after World War II. After World War II, the factories that produced, that had slaughterhouse waste and grain waste, worked with a veterinarian to design food made from those products. And they actually combined cereal and meat that was not usable by human consumption and developed a way to make it into a easily storable food, which turned out to be what we call kibble today. Kibble has gone through a variety of phases since then. It used to be in pellet form. Then they used an extruder and they filled it full of gas to make it bigger, but they had some trouble with bloat, so they went back to a smaller form, although not pellet. But when I got my first show dog, or not my first show dog, but the one that I started with in 1979, in the puppy contract was interesting because it said I had to feed Science Diet, which in 1979 was considered a premium dog food. And I remember going out and purchasing the dog food, my grandmother practically in tears, because she said the only food to feed dog was real food. And I thought my grandmother was old-fashioned and I wanted to be modern. Some of the things that developed after I started feeding that was larger stool, more odor in the stool, and also my dog developed tartar on his teeth. And I didn't think a lot about that at the time, although I reflect back on it now, I wonder why I didn't notice. And I began to add vitamins to the food, vitamin C and vitamin E in the early 80s, trying to get an edge for show dogs, and decided to do some more reading at that point. In 1985, at one of my show dogs, I had a black and tan coonhound named Ike, developed renal failure. And at that point, the prescription diets were just on the horizon. There weren't a lot. Science Diet used to make homemade meals, and I started making them homemade meals, but I didn't like the idea of white rice and just hamburger, so I did some research and learned about the percentages needed. At that point, I thought all the dogs were just wanting his food, and I just started feeding all of them home-cooked. But back to the history of dog food, after World War II, when people started, it became hit all the feed stores and didn't become a grocery store item until later in the 50s, people enjoyed the convenience of it. People were on the go, and they were getting used to washing machines and all the other modern conveniences, so just pouring kibble in a bowl was a lot easier for a lot of people. As that started developing, more people started buying processed dog food. Marketing became much more clever for it, and they began using fancier bags, because you used to only be able to buy dog food in a feed store in brown paper bags, but they started using color bags. They started doing television commercials, and some of us who are of that age can remember they used to have people touting dog food wearing white coats dressed up as veterinarians. And then later on they used celebrities. I don't know, some of you might remember Lauren Green with some of the, he worked for Alpo, and then they also had Gravy Train. They got fancy with that, and they showed some horses pulling actually a little wagon and a dog chasing it. They also got more clever with how they made dog food. They started making it in different colors. And like I said, with the Gravy Train with gravy, and some of you may have seen Puppy Chow where it says it's milk-coated. Of course, that's not really milk. But the basis of what I'm saying is most of the dog food in that point was pretty similar. They just used different marketing and different bag pictures and advertising to sell them as being somewhat different. In order to make a food that sits on the shelf, the dog food needs to be at least 40% carbohydrate, and that's true of any dry dog food you have today. In the older days, most of the dog food was corn-based, and it was usually higher than 40%, some as high as 50 or 60%, and corn was the popular choice. And then they started adding wheat, and as dog food developed, people complained about that. They changed it to rice. Some of you, there's still some food on, but predominantly it used to be chicken and rice and beef and rice. And then after that, the newest form is that was that they decided to use what they called non-grain when people started complaining about grain, and so they went to starches. So you'll see some of the newer foods, they say grain-free, but nonetheless, they're still quite high, usually about 40% in white potatoes or sweet potatoes. The problem with a high carbohydrate diet for dogs, whether it's potatoes, sweet potatoes, corn, wheat, or rice, is that dogs are carnivores. And I'm going to talk about that in a nutshell too, because that goes with this. Dogs are designed primarily to eat animal protein and fat. And that's what their digestive tract naturally can digest the easiest. A diet high in animal protein and animal fats produces smaller stool, less gastric problems, and less allergies. When you start feeding dogs a lot of carbohydrates, which would include the ones I talked about, there's some trouble there. The first one is dogs don't have amylase in their saliva like humans do. When we eat starches and grains, the amylase in our saliva breaks down the sugars. Dogs are unable to do that. So consequently what happens is when they consume kibble, it sticks to their teeth, and that's what creates the plaque and tartar and eventually the gum disease. The second thing that's difficult about carbohydrates for dogs is that they have a short and simple digestive tract, being carnivores. Their food spends more time in the stomach digesting than ours do, which is great because it means that they can kill a lot of bacteria that we can't. But due to the short intestinal tract, they have no ability to ferment, which means what fermenting does is break down carbohydrates into usable forms. Although for the most part, carbohydrates are sugars. Now, cows and horses have a magnificent way of dealing with such things. They have a very, very long digestive tract. They can break it down over and over. They can break down the cellulose around the cell walls so that it's utilized. The dogs cannot do that. So what happens is when a dog eats a dry dog food and when it comes out at the end, the natural progression is it's usually as much, if not bigger, than what went in, plus it has more odor because it's partially not digested and also because of the inability of the dog to ferment well. They can get gas and so forth on these foods, struggling to do so. When a dog is fed a diet that is more appropriate, such as the animal protein and fat, the stools are smaller and they have less odor because they're digested well.
Well, Lew, that's certainly an advantage.
Yeah.
Something else, that's a great reason to switch. Thank you.
Well, between the teeth and the stool, and the other thing is for my dogs that eat a raw diet, this is another benefit. There's two benefits to that. One is a dog that eats the raw diet. The stools come out, they're very small, they're very well formed, and they usually turn white within a day or two and blow away. And the other thing is that a dog, people talk about doggy odor, and I've seen things sold to reduce doggy odor, sweet-smelling shampoos and things of that nature, but what causes the dog odor isn't the dog itself, but the food they eat. And so many of the dry dog foods, because they're built for a long shelf life, but they use fat in it that will slowly become rancid. And so when you rub your hands through your dog's coat and you have an odor, it's the food you're smelling. Dogs that are fed a fresh food diet, whether raw or home cooked, don't have that. Their skin stays cleaner, and their coats stay more glossy, and it's just a much better thing. So between the dog odor and also dog breath, they have sweeter dog breath, because if you remove the starches and grains, their teeth are pearly white. They don't have gum disease. So you have good breath, and I hate going because it's a tasteful subject, but the stools don't smell. They're smaller formed, and they actually turn white and blow away. I hate to admit how many dogs I have. I have quite a bit. I live on 50 acres. I show dogs. I'm a judge. I have 18 Rottweilers at my home. And if you come to my house in my yard, you will not smell dog stool odor. It's just that remarkable, which is a big bonus.
Lew, I think that qualifies you to be the crazy dog lady, huh?
Oh, jeez. No. Ask my husband. So,
yeah.
But to get back to that, those are some of the benefits that I found when I started feeding, went back to home cook, and my grandmother was trying to tell me about 1985 and why it's evolved back into it. The other thing that carbohydrates do that I like to address a little bit is when a dog has a high carbohydrate diet, it's putting more sugar into their system, and a dog as a carnivore doesn't eat carbohydrates. They wouldn't in the wild, so they're being deluged with something they wouldn't normally have, and I suspect that a part of that leads to dogs having trouble with diabetes, which you really don't see in the wild, some adrenal disorders, and also because they're not getting a high-quality protein, and let me define that. High quality means high bioavailability, which means easy to digest. Since dog food is so heavily processed, it makes the food less digestible. When they're getting fresh food, it's more easily digested and utilized. So we also see things that you have to wonder about. Dogs that are domesticated friends that eat dry dog food, there seems to be a lot of renal disease, heart disease, and liver problems that should not be occurring. And if a dog is not getting good digestible protein, it does affect those organs. And I'll give you an example of that. Dogs, as carnivores, have to have more amino acids than we do. What's really important for dogs, though, is taurine, and heat kills taurine. When processed dog food is made, I'm talking about the dry type, it's heavily cooked for 2 or 3 days in big vats. I did visit 4 dog food plants in the mid-90s, and they do that partially to kill bacteria, partially to mix it up, and partially to make it into a consistency that is pretty smooth so they can make it back in and bake it into kibble form. But it destroys taurine and it destroys L-carnitine. Both of those are necessary for healthy hearts for dogs. Now, some dog food companies are adding that back in, which is good, but nonetheless, I would rather make my own food just so I can ensure it's there. And lastly, because of the pet food recalls, and I'm sure most of you have heard about those, I get a little concerned about relying on one brand of dog food, because if something should happen, my dog could get into trouble. If people must feed dry dog food, I tell them to switch brands frequently, just for that reason. And also because when you feed a dry dog food, unlike home cooking, you've locked your dog into one single formula. And even though pet food companies call their dog food complete and balanced, they keep changing when they find out new things. Your dog is locked into one recipe of food day in, day out. The nice thing about cooking or feeding raw is you can vary the diet. And when you vary the diet in a dog's food, for instance, proteins, you're varying the acids, the amounts, and the types. And you're also varying different vitamins and different minerals. That gives your dog a better chance of having a more complete and better diet than locking them into one recipe. I can't imagine what it would be like, but you don't see that for people, where we eat the same thing day in and day out. Even in people, they tell you eat variety. Now, we're different than dogs. They'll tell us to eat so many vegetables, so many fruits, but again, it's to give that variety of nutrients that we need. There's just so much to talk about. I'm going to try to, I need to move into the puppy diets. But I just want to say that even in 1974, and you have to realize, before I say that, who governs what's in dog food is the National Research Council, which is a government agency. And they set the guidelines for what should be in pet food, commercially made, whether it's dog, cat, all kinds of livestock as well. And there's another agency known as ASCO, which is the American Association of Feed Control Officials, who bring the results to the NRC and are supposedly taking care of what's in dog food to make sure it's safe and so on. But on the board of ASCO is mostly dog food company directors and so forth. In 1974, and they meet every so often, they got in a big fight because they said even though the dog food said it had so much protein, it did not identify if it was bioavailable or not. And by that I mean digestible. So they set up new guidelines to set up that they had to say that, and the dog food industry became so angry that they've never conformed to it. To try to conform to that kind of standard would be expensive for them, and understand the appeal of dry dog food is affordability, but they couldn't guarantee it. Anyway, for more information on the history of dog food, in my book, I devote the first chapter of the book to it, and it gives more detailed information. But as with anything else, it's a large corporate-run industry, and so I'm just telling people, beware and be wise. Always know how to read pet food labels. Understand what they mean and what that means for your dog's nutrition. Now, talking about puppy tips, that's a little easier subject. I get a lot of people who contact me and say, I'd like to switch my dog to something better, home-cooked or raw, or even mixing kibble and raw, and all three of those are addressed in the book. How you can feed just raw, how you can feed home-cooked, how you can mix home-cooked and raw, or how you can mix fresh food with kibble. It's at your comfort level. When I get people call me that have older dogs, I say something to them totally different than when people have new puppies. And I'm talking about puppies under 6 months. Puppies under that age are quite malleable. You can switch them right away to a raw or home-cooked diet without any trouble. Of course, you should know the basics on that. which is not hard. Dog nutrition is not rocket science. It's just understanding what they need. When you feed a raw diet, and you're feeding bones with that, the calcium is right there, so the food is naturally balanced. When you feed a home-cooked diet, you can't feed cooked bones. Once you cook bones, they become hard and brittle, the fat, due to the fat content. So you're going to have to add calcium to the dog's diet. And I usually recommend that people use either calcium citrate or calcium carbonate, both of which you can easily find at any grocery store, not to fit the dog, but to fit the amount of food. We're not balancing the dog, we're balancing the diet. And I recommend about 900 milligrams per pound of food served. Now for puppies. Puppies have a higher metabolism than adults, and I usually feed puppies about 4 meals a day, starting at about 7 weeks. I start weaning puppies at 4 weeks, and usually I wean them on to goat's milk and yogurt and egg, and then I start slowly introducing into that food ground meat of various sorts. I've also used canned mackerel, but I try to add it slowly to get used to it. You do not give puppies under 4 weeks any kind of whole food other than milk products and egg. The reason for that is at 4 weeks, until a puppy is 4 weeks, they don't absorb those nutrients well. And if you try to feed a puppy younger than that whole food, you can set them up for allergies or immune problems later on in life. Just a little tip. And puppies really shouldn't come home. They shouldn't leave the mother until they're about 8 weeks. So for any of you looking for puppies, you see 5, 6-week-old puppies, they need to be with their mothers. They also learn things like bite inhibition and things like that. So you get a puppy with less problems if they've been with the litter and their mother until at least 7 weeks, hopefully 8. But at that point, I feed my puppies 4 times a day. 2 of those meals are goat's milk, yogurt, and egg. And you can get goat milk at any grocery store. You can also find it in the baking goods in a condensed form, and then you add water. Plain yogurt is what I suggest, and just egg. What you feed a puppy is more than an adult. An adult dog eats about 2 to 3% of their body weight a day. For instance, a 100-pound dog would eat 2 to 3 pounds a day. A 50-pound dog would eat half of that, and so forth. I have charts in my book on that. I'm not the greatest in math, but I had somebody help me, thank goodness. And then it would be the same, and it would be for home-cooked and raw. But 2 of the meals being the goat's milk, yogurt, and egg. The other meal in a raw diet for a puppy is just ground muscle meat and organ meat, and the other meal is raw meaty bones. It's the euphemism we use for any kind of meat that's easy to chew with bones and meat. And that would include chicken necks, chicken wings, chicken backs, pork, and you don't think of it that way, but those bones are fairly soft, pork ribs, pork necks, things of that nature. Puppies just take to this really well, and kittens too, for those of you that have cats. When they get older, what happens is when we try to switch the diet is they're like dogs are like us, and cats are like us in the way that once we get used to something, it's hard to change. Dry dog food has its own texture, while fresh food has a totally different texture. Even though it smells good, they'll approach it, and they're not quite sure what to do with it. So sometimes we have to take a few steps to get them to that point. We may mix the fresh food with their kibble and so forth for a while until we can move them over. The supplements that I add, and I've had people say, well, why would you add supplements to fresh food? Shouldn't it have everything in it? And for the most part it does. But there are some supplements I do like to add. One is fish oil. The fish oil that comes in capsules, I usually give 1 per 10 pounds of body weight. The same reason I take fish oil every day. Fish oil helps with the immune system. It helps with the skin and coat. It helps with brain and eye development. So it has some very good things in it. Now, years ago when animals would forage in the wild, they would get plenty of vitamin E, although it's hard to find, because the meat they ate was grazing off of grasses and so forth that are high in omega-3. But now when you buy meat, Most of it's grain-fed, and it's not so high in omega-3 anymore. Omega-3 is also found in canned fish, which, not tuna. I'm not talking tuna, but I'm talking canned salmon, canned sardines, and canned mackerel. That's another good source. The other kind of vitamins I like to add, and you have to remember where I'm coming from. I show dogs, so I try to make sure that they're at their top form, is a B-complex, vitamin C, and vitamin E. And there's more information on the book if you're interested. But they're good antioxidants, and they're helpful in many other ways. For the most part, you never add minerals to a diet when you're feeding fresh food because the meat served in the food is very high in minerals. The only mineral you need to add, as I mentioned, is calcium, simply to balance it. And that's probably more important for puppies than any other age. So, Ellen, I think I've about covered it. If you have questions.
You have, Lou, and I appreciate it. Really terrific stuff. I read your book, and I'm a big fan of the raw diet, and Yogi, my golden doodle, is now enjoying his new menu. And we have some questions that were emailed in from the audience. I'd like to pose them to you. And please, I'd like to encourage anybody that has any questions that's in the audience, feel free to send them in. Again, it's Ellen at NuBowWow.com, and that's ELLEN at NuBowWow. And also feel free to purchase Lou's book. I can highly recommend it. You can purchase it right off our site. On the landing page where you actually got the access code is you can click right on the book or on the link below it, and that'll take you right to Amazon, and it'll give you a good deal on the book. So feel free to do that. And let me get into some of the questions now, if I might. First question is, once you're feeding your dog raw meat, what do you suggest for traveling?
That's a very good question, and I travel quite a bit because I go to dog shows, and sometimes I go cross-country with several dogs. The beauty of feeding a raw diet is you can get whatever you need at any grocery store. And I can remember traveling years ago when I used to feed kibble, and if I ran out of that brand, I had a heck of a time finding it. But I'll give a couple of tips on traveling. A cooler, of course, is of essence. And there's even the kind you can buy now, the Eagle, that you can even plug into your cigarette lighter. A lot of folks use that. But, of course, that depends on how many dogs you have. I just bag up my dogs' meals into individual meals, and when I throw them in the cooler, that's good for at least 3 days. If I'm going to be going longer, the Igloo cooler is a good idea. But I can also go to the grocery store, and I make do. I'll buy yogurt and hamburger, and I'll find chicken backs or chicken wings, pork ribs. You know, they have them anywhere, and I've got my dog's meals together.
I'm sorry, but when you said that you can travel with the cooler and you know, and the food is in the cooler for 3 days, it keeps for 3 days, or?
Yes.
Okay. And is it frozen going into it, or how does that work?
I just bag it up into individual meals. I like Ziploc baggies, and I use those. But I've got a friend who backpacks, and she takes along canned mackerel and canned sardines and salmon with her, and then she also, you can buy tripe, which is really a gruesomely stinky item that dogs like. It's green tripe. You can buy that in cans too. And you know, I tell people if you're really in a pinch, there are some better canned foods out there too that you can take when you're traveling if you're just not going to be in an area where you can grab stuff.
Is there any that you can suggest, Lou, off the top of your head?
Well, I'm out of that loop so bad. The canned tripe is great, and I think it's Wysong makes an all-meat diet, Call of the Wild, I think it's called. And there's some other good ones too, and I'm trying to remember the names of them because I go to a store here in Houston that carries all that kind of stuff. Mainly, you're just going to make sure you read the can and make sure it's not loaded with, you know, grains or carbohydrates, that most of it's meat.
Okay. And with that in mind, what percentage of the dog's diet do you suggest is carbohydrate? Are you saying none, or is there a small percentage?
My dogs that eat a raw diet get no carbohydrates, and that's exactly what they'd get in the wild, and that's what's natural. For people who want to home cook, and there's either a couple reasons people would home cook. One is because they just can't bring themselves to do raw. They need to think about it or ease their way into it. Or another is for special health needs, dogs with renal issues, some dogs with severe liver issues. You need to home cook because you do need a certain amount of carbohydrates for specific reasons. One is to help with absorb certain things, and in dogs with renal issues, they need to eat a lower phosphorus diet, but that gets a little bit complex. But in a home-cooked diet, for a perfectly healthy dog, I recommend that 75% of it be animal protein, which could be yogurt, cottage cheese, meat, eggs, and the other 25% is carbohydrates. And remember, dogs can't digest any carbohydrates unless they're completely broken down, which means either cooked or completely pureed, because they can't break down the cellulose wall. And the reason that we add carbohydrates to home-cooked diets isn't for the nutrition value, but it's so that it adds some bulk for fiber for stool formation.
Okay, and that's actually going to be my next question was, is it okay to mix some kibble in, again, just to add some substance to the meal?
Well, you could. You don't have to. Again, some people want to start out, their part of the marketing of pet food is that fear that you can't do it, and that's complete and balanced, and that's only what dogs should eat. We've all had vets tell us at some point, never feed your dog table food, so some people go into it a little fearful. And you can feed a diet of about 50% kibble and 50% fresh food.
Okay.
But when you add fresh food to kibble, don't add any more carbohydrates. Only use animal-based products.
Okay. And another question is, if you have, I think you answered it, but I just want to clarify it. If you have a 100-pound dog, so you're saying you feed 2 to 3% of their body weight, so that would be 2 to 3 pounds of meat per day if you have a 100-pound dog?
Right, or that would be like 4 to 6 cups.
Okay.
There's approximately 2 cups in a pound.
Okay.
But I need to address the end of it. Toy breeds, those are generally dogs under 10 to 15 pounds, usually need a little bit more food because they have a higher metabolism. Toy breeds eat about 5% of their body weight a day, and it's also important to feed toy breeds 3 to 4 times a day rather than once or twice because they can have issues with hypoglycemia.
Okay. Okay, that's great. Okay, and I think you may have answered this, but what is the best alternative to raw diet that can easily be transported?
Yeah, I answered that in part.
I think you did.
I mean, there are some freeze-dried foods, although to be honest, freeze-drying is also processing. It's, it has to be heated and frozen and flash frozen and dehydrated. But there are some of those that you can use, and then the better canned dog foods, and like I said, canned fish is fine.
Okay. Another question that came in was, can you occasionally feed your dog cooked food, and what effect does that have if you're doing a raw diet?
That's fine. It's absolutely no problem. And I've given my dogs a lot of cooked food, table scraps. I don't give them carbohydrates too much, but, it's just me and my husband. We make a turkey for Thanksgiving, and 3 days later you kind of look at the rest of that turkey kind of bleary-eyed. So I've cut the meat off the bone and given it to them.
Yeah, that was actually the scenario in the Stevie household recently. Yogi ate a lot of turkey for a while.
Right, exactly.
Now, the other thing I think that I took from the book, too, is that that dogs have a different, they metabolize the fat better, we as humans try to sort of stay away from that. At least in fact, the humans are not, so well regarded. But for dogs, I think, what you were saying in the book is that actually is something that you want to give them. They digest it.
Dogs don't get hardening of the arteries or plaque. They don't have the cholesterol problem that we do. Dogs use fat for energy, and it's kind of interesting to note the sled dog racers, when they're running their dogs, their diets are like 40% fat, which is, if we fed our dogs that, they'd be obese, but it just gives more energy and it generates warmth, and especially if dogs in colder weather need to have more fat just to keep warm. Now, if in a dog's blood work, I want to mention this, occasionally the cholesterol can get high, but it doesn't mean they're going to have a heart attack or a stroke. And dogs don't have strokes. They have vestibular incidences. It's a little bit different, but they're protected that way. But high cholesterol in a dog usually means one of two things. It can mean more than that, but basically it can mean that they're hypothyroid. It can mean that they may be starting to get Cushing's disease, which is an adrenal disorder, or in certain breeds like miniature schnauzers, they have lipid problems, which can cause that, and that's more genetic.
Okay. When you feed a dog, if you switch, when you're just doing canned food, be it all natural or whatever, they always, caution you to not switch foods quickly. You have to do it slowly. Now, I think that's where the question as far as feeding a raw diet and a cooked diet, so there's no adverse effect to the dog when you switch diets, and why would there be an adverse effect when you switch, when you're feeding them, like say a kibble or a canned food?
That's an interesting question, and I don't have an answer to that. And I have a Yahoo email group called Canine Nutrition, and it's got about 5,000 or 6,000 members, and that question comes up on occasion, and we always marvel over that because I remember I would feed my dog one kibble, and you'd run out on the road, and I made that reference a little earlier. We knew that if we'd switch, who knows, would your dog get blowouts or, have bad gas? And I'm not sure. The only thing I can figure out is because it's such a fixed formula that the dog's body becomes accustomed to it, and any change at all is disruptive. But for some reason, when we feed a raw diet, or if you feed raw or home-cooked, or you mix them, we seem to be able to use a lot more variety of food and not get that upset stomach. And I rarely hear people who have dogs on raw or home-cooked diets use the term sensitive stomach. It's just almost like that disappears. Part of that might be as fresh food, raw food and cooked food is easier to digest because it's not processed. And I think it has to do with the processing, but I'm not quite sure why. A lot of dog food companies use certain things in their food to make stools hard. That includes beet pulp, clay, different kinds of clay, and all kinds of things. What those items do is they draw out the moisture out of the large intestine so that to create a firmer stool. But since all of that is not in the home-cooked or the raw, they just seem to be able to easily switch from one to the other. I've brought home new cuts of meat they've never had before, and they may not like them, but if they do and they eat them, I don't get that upset like I used to.
Okay, well that makes a lot of sense. Speaking of your canine group, we have a question from one of your members, and the question is: I'm a staunch believer in eating an organic diet with either pure well, spring water, or which has been filtered. When reading posts to the canine group for the past several months, there are two issues that I have not seen seen come up. Seems to me that the best raw diet in the world won't be the best if using poor quality meats, eggs, dairy, supplements, etc., such as the folks are buying at places like Walmart.
Well, I can address that from several levels. I have 18 dogs. I am not about to buy Okay, although there's really not
I know
such
where
thing.
you're going with this, Lou.
Well, there's really not such a thing as organic meat because you can't really call meats organic. You can call them free range. You can call them hormone and antibiotic free, and like with chickens, they can be cage free. And when I buy eggs, I'm a sucker. I buy cage free eggs. I can't stand the idea otherwise. But with my amount of dogs, there's no way I could buy that quality of meat. It would the prices. I'm not sure where the person who's writing is from, but I think it's about the same anywhere. I'm in Texas. I'd pay anywhere from $4 to $10 a pound.
Okay.
So my philosophy is, if you have 1 or 2 dogs and you want to do that, yes, it probably is much better. But you have to look at the economics of today's world, and I've been watching the news today. I don't want to go into that, but it isn't getting any better right now. So I think it's better for a dog to eat chicken from Walmart than a heavily processed dry dog food. So there's different levels you can take this diet for health for your dog, and we have to be where people are at, what they can afford. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. And I have another question for you. And this audience member writes in, I'm still hesitant about feeding my dog chicken bones. I'm afraid they will splinter or get caught in his throat.
That's a good question, too. The first time I ever fed raw chicken, my husband slept in the kitchen for 3 nights. And I don't want to make light of him, but I think he really expected blood to spurt from every orifice of the dog's body. But you have to remember this, and it is a leap of faith when you first do it, because we have been told never feed your dog's bones, right?
Well, that's exactly where I think this person is coming from.
Exactly. And as I mentioned, never feed your dog cooked bones. But when you feed your dog raw bones, of the bones that I talk about in my book, and I have lists, I'm very specific in my book, I tell which kind of raw meaty bones to feed, what kind of muscle meat, and so on and so forth, and I also go into detail about how much, percentages, and so forth, is that chickens are kind of a funny beast in and of itself, but poultry has hollow bones. They're not full of fat, and the reason for that is because they're an animal that can fly. So those bones are very safe when raw. And as I mentioned, pork bones for some reason are quite soft. There are some bones that I don't always recommend feeding. I will feed turkey necks. I cut them in half. I have big dogs. But I won't feed turkey wings because they have some spines in them, because that's a huge wing that opens up, and we can have problems with those. And I mention all those in the book, too. But I have yet to have anybody, like I said, Canine Nutrition has over 5,000 members. It's been going on since 1999. I haven't had anybody ever mention an incident with a problem with chicken bones. And let me tell you, when people have problems, that's what they post about, so it would have been on there.
Now, and there is an advantage to feeding them the bones. There's calcium in the bones, and that's good for the dogs. Is that correct?
Yes, there's calcium in the bones, and there's other minerals as well, and it's just very mineral rich. One of the issues I want to address real quick, since we're on that subject, is vitamin D. I often advise people to give a supplement with vitamin D in it, because vitamin D is hard to get in feeding a raw diet or home-cooked diet. It does come in certain things, but I prefer to add a little bit of that. Okay. And usually I only add maybe 400 I use per 100-pound dog, so that can go down pretty low.
Now, in practice, I mean, basically you would just buy a whole chicken and, maybe cut it in half and feed the dog that? I know it's a simple question. It's hard to wrap your head around, when you're used to. Go ahead.
Right. When I feed chicken, and I do buy free range chicken necks and backs. And I use them a lot. And why do I use those a lot? Because they're less expensive. However, I have bought whole chickens when they go on sale, and I cut them up into probably smaller pieces than that, but it depends on the size of dog you're talking about. For smaller dogs, let's say dogs under 20 pounds, necks and backs are they're a little bit softer. Their necks are mostly cartilage, and it's easier for them to consume. But larger dogs, I have a lot of friends who have Rottweilers like I do. They buy leg quarters, and they may give them to them whole or cut them in half. But if they also, for a big dog like a Rottweiler, I could probably take a small fryer chicken and cut it in half and just give it half.
Okay.
And the other thing I want to mention is for people who have more than one dog, they ask, how am I going to feed that many dogs, and I don't want them getting my carpets dirty and all of that, and I certainly understand that. My dogs, for the most part, I feed them in crates. You talk about crate training probably on your website, don't you?
Yes. Yeah. Well, not on the website, but in the book that's in the puppy starter kit. Yes.
Right. The book that's in the puppy starter kit. I really like to feed dogs in their crates for a couple reasons, to keep the mess down. But for dogs, eating is more of, if they were in the wild and let's say they, this is sort of gruesome, but they bring down a deer, what they do is they don't all sit and munch on the deer. Now, some of them grab the good parts right away, and I won't go into detail about that. But most of the time they get a part of it off and they drag it away from there and eat in solitude. So it's best to let them have that type of solitude in the way they eat.
Okay.
And it's also a way to monitor how much they eat and so forth. So.
Okay, if you were to, if there was, one or two questions that you are most frequently asked, if we haven't covered that tonight, Lew, what would you say that those were?
Well, one that I covered briefly is how much does it cost, and how do I shop for this? And I tell people it depends on the amount of dogs you have, but if you just have a few, I look in the bargain bins at the supermarket, but I also suggest that you don't go to your high dollar end deluxe gourmet supermarket, that you shop at ethnic type supermarkets, or at least to cater to that type of crowd. Hispanic supermarkets are great. Oriental supermarkets are great. That's where you'll often find necks and backs and other things, and other delicacies that aren't expensive, like chicken feet and duck feet. Yes, dogs love them. And things like kidneys and liver. So you have to kind of know where to shop. And many cities also, the bigger cities, have food co-ops that you can join just for dogs, where people buy in case lots together. And I go to my supermarket here, what we have here in Texas, Kroger's is what I have closest to me, is I buy certain meats by the case, and I get a better deal, but I have lots of big dogs.
And are you okay with freezing?
Yes, in fact, and that's another question. Let's talk about pork. People always say, oh, should I feed my dog pork? Won't they get trichinosis? Well, we haven't had that problem in the United States for about 25 years. The reason is because deep freezing kills it. And all pork before we get it is deep frozen.
Okay.
And you can unfreeze and freeze meat 2 or 3 times without any problem. I often get cases of hard frozen food. I'll thaw them, repackage them, and throw them back in the freezer. Mm-hmm.
Let me ask, does that work the same with humans? Can you do that with humans and have the meat be okay?
I don't know that. I'm not going to address that question.
I just thought,
probably so, but I don't want to get sued. I'm married to an attorney. He always cautions me not to talk about people.
Say less. Say less.
Right.
Less is more, right?
Right, but it is true for dogs, and a lot of the meat you'll get out of the case has been frozen once or twice. They'll take a cow and cut it into half and freeze that, and then they'll thaw it and cut it up into pieces and freeze it again.
Right. Yeah. As somebody that is in the throngs of switching from canned food, although I thought I was doing the right thing with using all the natural products, etc. But after reading your book and making you convinced me absolutely, and making the transition from the can to the raw. These questions, you've answered a lot of questions in making the transition a lot easier. So,
well, here's another question I get. Won't my dog get a bacterial infection and die from raw meat? And I want to address that real quick. First of all, any meat that you purchase, if handled with normal care, is perfectly fine. You have to use common sense. And people worry about salmonella from chicken and so forth, but understand dogs aren't people. In the wild, it's natural for dogs to take food, and if they have too much, bury it and come back and eat it 3 days later. Now think about that. And we've all walked our dogs down the road or in the park, and they find something flat, some animal that's been squashed, and eat it, and we scream, and they're fine. Dogs drink pond water, which is teeming with salmonella. They sniff and lick each other in places I won't mention here. And there are many dogs, although dogs on a raw diet generally don't do this, but some dogs that eat stool, and they don't get sick and die. And if you're going to get bacteria, the place where it's going to be worse is in stool. They did a test on stool of dogs that ate raw and stool of dogs that ate kibble, and there was not much difference in the amount of bacteria.
Right.
And in fact, if you go on Google and plug in bacteria and dogs and food, you don't come up with raw food. You come up with recalls on pet food.
Okay. Well, listen, Lou, we are winding down and running out of time. This has been terrific. I hope everybody out there in Cyberland has enjoyed Lou's presentation. If you like what you heard, please feel free to purchase her book. Again, you can buy it right off our website. Lou, I'd like to thank you for your time tonight. It was very enlightening for me and for my dog Yogi. he appreciates the fact that I picked up your book, and for everybody in the audience, please stay tuned. The NuBowWow sponsors monthly presentations, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Please stay tuned. Lou, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
Have a great night.
You too. Good night.
All right. Bye-bye.